There are days when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Vladimir Lenin. This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy. Guten Tag, Buenos Dias, Morgen, and welcome to episode 187 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. I know it's ironic to quote Vladimir Lenin, not just as a Bitcoiner, but as an American because, well, he was a freaking communist. But that quote, "There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen," feels particularly poignant today. As you know, unless you were hiding under a rock, yesterday was election day here in the United States. And I know many of you are getting really tired of the political talk recently. I mean, even Leggy referenced this in their boost last week when they boosted and said, "Thanks for the episode. Only one more week until the final of Red versus Blue." And that being said, there is no way to ignore the implications for Bitcoin and for Bitcoiners in what happened yesterday here in the United States. I'll try not to harp on it too much, but it is important to take stock of where we are, where we potentially stand now. But as usual, before we get into all of that, let's take that customary look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. At the time of this recording, we are sitting at a block height of 869,189, and Bitcoin is ringing in at a US dollar value of $75,770, just a few $100s shy of its new all-time high that it set this afternoon. And that means that for every dollar you convert into Bitcoin, you will receive 1,320 Satoshis. So obviously, as number goes up, the number of Satoshis that we're going to be able to receive per dollar goes down. That's just the way it is. Hopefully you've been stacking alongside us for the last 3 years. If not, you're not too late, but that window obviously is closing or at least narrowing. Bitcoin's current US dollar value gives it a market capitalization of $1.5 trillion, $1.5 trillion, up significantly since last DCA Wednesday. And, it's up exactly 50% from that magic number, that 1 trillion mark, where Bitcoin, I think, was finally in the big leagues. Where in normie land and the TradFi media, Bitcoin finally became a force to be reckoned with, a legitimate investment class in their opinion, not something that they could just write off as something niche, but one of the most valuable commodities in the world. For those of you who value your wealth still in shiny yellow rocks, it will now cost you 28.2 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin, creeping up on that 2 full pounds of gold per Bitcoin number. And I know Peter Schiff was out there celebrating, posting a post that had to have reflected peak gold when he was partying with Florida and just making a spectacle of himself and actually posting it on his Twitter account. I try not to follow Peter Schiff too much, but he's just really, really been gloating as gold was going on to set record highs, which while that might seem impressive, is up maybe 50% in the last couple of years when gold, when Bitcoin in the same time frame is up thousands of percent. But again, they say you get Bitcoin at the price you deserve. And if you're a gold bug right now, that price is 28.2 ounces of gold, another window that is rapidly closing as we get to the point where we're going to be talking about Bitcoin in terms of pounds of gold per Bitcoin. I firmly believe before the end of the year, we're certainly well on the way to that metric anyway. For those of you who continue to value your wealth in things like food security, one Bitcoin will currently purchase you 4,237 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's. That is one pizza a day, every day for more than 11 and a half years. in multiple episodes going back for almost the history of this podcast, I've been saying that I don't think if you had one full Bitcoin, you would ever be able to spend it in your entire lifetime purchasing just one pizza a day, because 11 and a half years from now, that's almost 3 full cycles now. And if history continues to rhyme, even if it doesn't repeat, but we continue to have a post-halving bull run where the value of Bitcoin goes up 10-fold or 20-fold or whatever it goes up, as a result of each halving, or if we break out of the cycle altogether and just go to that hyper Bitcoinization, what do they call that? I'm having a Joe Biden moment here, but basically, if it goes up into the right forever, if we break out of the halving cycle and we just continue to trend up to where we eclipse gold's market cap and become the world's reserve currency, the price of Bitcoin will appreciate so fast, it will go up in value faster than you can spend it on pizza. And we're almost there already. I mean, we've already gained a year and a half worth of pizza in just the last month alone, and you ain't seen nothing yet, because this bull run is just getting ready to roll. In fact, this might even be a little bit of a false start because of the euphoria from the election results that we'll get into in a bit. Because remember, I said previously that I wasn't expecting Bitcoin to eclipse its previous all-time high until later this month, sometime around maybe Thanksgiving or even as late as Christmas. Of course, this isn't out of the realm of possibility that we'd be here organically had it not been for Donald Trump making Bitcoin a part of his campaign, courting Bitcoiners, promising to make the United States the Bitcoin capital of the world. Obviously, that's a golden swan. That's the golden swan of golden swans. I think that's even a bigger deal, obviously, than the spot Bitcoin ETFs. Clearly it is, because the spot Bitcoin ETFs just means Wall Street and normies were going to start pumping more US dollars into Bitcoin. But by making the United States a more Bitcoin friendly country, that just helps the whole world flood into Bitcoin, and to do so in a manner where they're not going to be harassed or worried about, Bitcoin confiscation or, government attempts to make Bitcoin illegal. And I know that they can't, that, governments can't ban Bitcoin. They can just ban themselves from benefiting from Bitcoin, but it certainly would help dramatically to have a slightly more friendly situation in the United States as far as, using your Bitcoin goes. And I'm getting way ahead of myself, but how they're making Bitcoin harder to use by making every single Bitcoin event a taxable capital gain transaction, where you have to track, each Satoshi in minutia and figure out what your cost basis was, what you sold it for, what your quote unquote capital gain was, and then file a line item on your tax return, paying taxes on that little tiny transaction, regardless how small it is. Little things like that can go a long way to helping Bitcoin realize its potential as a peer-to-peer electronic currency. That's one of the reasons why I firmly believe we haven't gotten there yet, as far as, transactions at your local coffee shop, et cetera. I know that is possible, and more places are accepting Bitcoin now. But one of the reasons I don't think we're there yet is because nobody wants to deal with complying with the law in all those capital gains transactions, at least here in the United States. Of course, I'm looking at this through the lenses of where I'm sitting behind this microphone right now. I realize not everywhere in the world has to deal with that, but that's not the point. The point is, governments can't ban Bitcoin, but they can do their darnest to make it a pain in the tuchus to use. And it's nice to have an incoming administration that promises to do the opposite for a change. All right, that metric that has been my favorite for most of the history of this podcast, Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate, is actually a lackluster 5.65 transactions per second, down significantly from the last 2 DCA Wednesdays in a row, the last 3 or 4 actually. And I don't know if that is because, this pump is just getting started, or whether it's because all of the transactions that we've seen in the last 24 hours have been legitimate on-chain transactions and we're crowding out some of those spam transactions. That remains to be seen, but this is one of the first times I'm looking at that metric, and it's not corresponding to what we had seen in previous episodes, where when the price is rallying, the transactions are through the roof, and when the transactions are declining, the price is declining as well. So again, I always said that, correlation isn't necessarily causation or vice versa, but it has been interesting to look at, and it will be interesting to continue to monitor that metric. And speaking of on-chain activity, the Bitcoin mempool is actually a little emptier than it was last DCA Wednesday as well. Of course, that makes sense if there's fewer transactions per second. Clark Moody's dashboard mempool is saying that he has 107,023 transactions in their mempool, down almost 30,000 transactions from last DCA Wednesday. So pretty significant decline in transactions. Mempool.space, with their slightly larger mempools, also telling a similar story. They're showing 180,315 transactions in their mempool. That's also down about 20,000 transactions from last DCA Wednesday. So that certainly would seem to jive with the metric of fewer on-chain transactions per second. It would also seem to mean that a lot of this price pump that we saw, a lot of it last night as the election results were unfolding, is maybe just the beginning of what we're getting ready to see. And I think that regardless of what caused the price increase and where the price is right now, we're still early as far as what I would expect from this halving cycle bull run anyway. So buckle up, Buttercup. Things are getting ready to get really, really exciting. Even if the price of Bitcoin retraces a little bit in the next week, as you know, the euphoria from the election wears off. Because remember, Trump won't even be sworn in until January of next year, the end of January next year, January 20th. And so he can't even begin to start enacting any of his pro-Bitcoin policies or any of his campaign promises for a couple months now. So it would be reasonable to assume that the euphoria, the hype from the win will fade and wane, and then any influence that the election results are going to ultimately have on Bitcoin, will really start kicking off next spring. And boy, that will be like pouring gasoline on the fire, because if we already are in the middle of a face melting bull run because of the halving and the supply shock from, the miner reward having been cut in half last spring, when we start making it easier for Bitcoin businesses to maybe have banking relationships, or maybe we get some favorable tax rules, that can only help. Yippee-ki-yay, as they say. You ain't seen nothing. You ain't seen nothing yet. And speaking of on-chain activity, if you do need to make an on-chain transaction, right now is as cheap as it's been. Clark Moody's dashboard fee estimator is saying that a high priority transaction needs to have a fee of just 4 sats per VByte. That's almost half of what they were recommending last DCA Wednesday, and that a fee of just 2 sats per VByte will be mined within a day. That's also their lowest fee recommendation, regardless of how long you want to wait. As I mentioned last DCA Wednesday, I did a big consolidation transaction or moved to a different hardware wallet setup, and I set my fee at 2 sats per VByte, and it was mined in the very next block, even though the fee recommendation was slightly higher. I lowballed it because I was willing to wait. It turns out I didn't need to. Mempool.space always tells a slightly different story, and they're recommending a fee of 3 sats per VByte, regardless of the priority of your transaction. That works out to just 32 cents in US dollar terms. Down significantly from that anomaly we saw last week, where they were recommending a $75 fee for a high priority transaction. Again, that's a little bit cheaper than Clark Moody's fee recommendation, but they're also saying that any transaction should include a minimum fee of 3 sats per VByte. So still 32 cents to be able to move basically an unlimited amount of money anywhere in the world within the next 10 minutes, to have absolute transaction finality, shortly thereafter, depending on how many confirmations you want to wait for your transaction before you consider it written in stone. Because, there are times when, just through the nature of the protocol, 1 or 2 blocks might come in back to back or close enough to each other where you get, a little bit of a chain reorg and you get an orphan block or whatever. So that's why most people want to wait 5 or 6 blocks before they consider a transaction final. But either way, that's still a lot faster than the traditional financial system settles transactions. You might feel like when you make a transaction, if you wire somebody some money, or if you make a debit card transaction, that's instant, but it is not. Those transactions be clawed back oftentimes for months before you actually have finality in the traditional financial system. So again, I'm rambling a little bit. I need to get back to these vital statistics so we can get on to the news. So, speaking of mining and Bitcoin blocks, since the last DCA Wednesday episode, it got a lot more difficult to mine a block of Bitcoin. We had an upwards difficulty adjustment of 6.2%. For those of you who don't know this, Bitcoin automatically adjusts the difficulty that it takes to find the next block every 2016 blocks, so approximately every 2 weeks. with the goal of having blocks coming in at an average time of 10 minutes between blocks. When blocks are coming in what it deems too fast, it gets more difficult to mine the next block. If they're coming in too slow, and that does happen sometimes, the difficulty is relaxed. Either way, just like Bitcoin's price, network difficulty has gone up and to the right as more hash rate has poured onto the network, as more miners have been added to the network, and as those miners have gotten more advanced and more powerful. So we are currently, we just had that adjustment about a day and a half ago. So we're currently 1,723 blocks away from that next difficulty adjustment, about 12 days. So almost 2 weeks away. And so it's way too early to tell what that's going to look like. But I would anticipate, again, it's going to be up and to the right, especially as miners start to become profitable again, as the price of Bitcoin goes up to make up for the fact that the miner rewards went down. But either way, looking at it as it stands, the estimates are that it will be at least an upward difficulty adjustment of between 0.3 and 0.56%. Although the block time average in just the very, very beginning of this mining difficulty epoch has been exactly 10 minutes and 0 seconds between blocks. So obviously, if that were to remain the case, we would look at no difficulty adjustment upwards or downwards. Obviously, that's probably not going to be the case because network hash rate has continued to go up. Currently, it's estimated there are 665.7 exahashes of mining power securing the network. That is up more than 7 exahashes from last DCA Wednesday. So again, as mining power goes up and to the right, that theoretically, again, it's finding a block is like random chance. And that's why they take an average, such a large average, a sample size of 2016 blocks, because sometimes blocks just come in faster or slower, regardless of what the difficulty is. But since more hash rate is pouring out of the network, it would make sense that the block time is going to speed up a bit, and we'll see another fairly significant difficulty increase in about 2 weeks. But again, only time will tell. That's one of those things nobody has a crystal ball on. But when you zoom out and you look at the big picture, you'd expect difficulty to continue climbing, especially when we start setting new all-time highs one after another during the bull run, and more and more people get into mining, or miners that are already in the mining start turning on some of those old ASICs that weren't profitable because they're outdated. We see a lot more Antminer S9s probably turn on, and maybe places with really cheap or free electricity even are turning on old Antminer S7s. But you get the point. Before we go any further, I want to take a minute to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats on a minute per minute basis, where you set an amount of Satoshis that you feel that you're receiving in value from this podcast by listening, and then you stream it back automatically as you're listening, whether that's 1 Satoshi per minute or 10 Satoshis per minute or 100 sats per minute, and that is up to you. And that's a really super convenient way to support any of your favorite podcasts. But the most popular method, and my favorite, is by sending a boost, and a boost is a shout out, but it's a shout out via the Lightning Network. So since it's a Lightning transaction, you're letting me know what you think, saying hi, whatever you want to say, but you're also sending some Satoshis back, and you don't have to worry about how much you're streaming. You just kind of do a one-time boost. Of course, we read that boost that we received last week from Leggy. We read it last week, and of course, we read it at the beginning of this podcast as well. We do not currently have any boosts to read, but if you do send a boost, we do read those boosts on the forthcoming episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. And we haven't had to censor or not read a boost yet because Bitcoiners are class people. We might be a little funny, we might be a little quirky, but we're also not a-holes usually. So all the shout outs we've received have been informative or cordial or pertinent. We haven't had to censor them. If for some weird reason somebody sent a really, really bizarre, unhinged boost, maybe we would have to apologize and not read it, but that hasn't been the case. Speaking of our listeners, our geographic distribution of listeners has remained exactly the same. Our top 10 countries for listeners remain as follows. Number 1 remains the United States, where more than half of you are listening. So hello and thank you to my fellow Americans listening, regardless of who you voted for in the election, although I have a feeling that I know which way the Bitcoin community skewed, especially after the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. But there's also those people out there, such as the progressive Bitcoiners, that are probably feeling a little butthurt today. And we welcome you and thank you for listening as well if you fall into that category. Number 2, as usual, remains Argentina. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Argentina. Number 3 remains Germany. So guten Abend, dankeschön, mein Freunds in Deutschland. Number 4 remains Canada. So hello to those of you up in the soon-to-be frozen white north. I've seen a lot more of the migratory birds start arriving in Florida. We get, in Florida, we have a lot of birds that would normally be migratory. Like when I lived out west, the sandhill cranes and the whooping cranes came down for the winter, and then they flew back up north to Canada for the summer. Here we have the crane population year round, but there are plenty of colorful songbirds that are working their way down to Florida for the winter, which means it's probably getting cold up there. So if you are trying to heat your house with an Antminer and shivering a little bit while you're listening to this podcast, special shout out to you plebs for making your listenership known in such numbers that you remain number 4. Number 5 remains Luxembourg. So Dankeschön, mein Freunds in Luxembourg. Morian to those of you who speak Luxembourgish. Number 6 remains the United Kingdom. So a special thank you to our cousins across the pond in the UK, kind of where the United States got its start almost 250 years ago. Number 7 remains Singapore. So apa kabar to those of you listening in Singapore. Number 8 remains Spain. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Spain. Number 9 remains Colombia. Hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Colombia. And number 10 remains Mexico. Again, hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Mexico. On to the news. As usual, the price is the news and the news is the price. And that is especially true on a day like today where we just set a brand new all-time high. Of course, the US dollar price of Bitcoin started skyrocketing last night as the election results started to come in, and it started to look more and more like Donald Trump was going to win the presidential election. Of course, the same thing happened with the stock futures. I was monitoring both the election results and the Bitcoin price, and I saw the uptick in price in real time. Investor.com ran the headline, Bitcoin bolts to record high on GOP sweep. Analysts eye 100K. The price of Bitcoin hit a record above $75,000 Tuesday night. Industry pros look for 100K in 2025. Of course, when Wall Street went to work this morning, the trend continued. Rather than becoming a buy the rumor, sell the news scenario, all of the stock indexes in the United States closed up. The S&P 500 closed up 2.53%. The Dow closed up 3.57%. The NASDAQ closed up almost 3%. And the Russell 2000 closed up more than 5%. About the only thing that went down was gold, which went down almost 3% on the day. And as it stands, depending on where you get your price data, because even the last cycle all-time high, some sources were showing that Bitcoin's all-time high was only 66,000. Others are showing 69,000. Same thing with 2017, when only a handful of sites showed Bitcoin actually hitting 20,000 and others had it in around the $18,000 range. But depending where you get your data, the all-time high was sometime this afternoon, and it was just a little over $76,000. I think I saw close to 76,500 at one point. We've obviously pulled back a tiny bit, but still up just huge, as Donald Trump would say, for the day. In the last 24 hours, Bitcoin's up almost 10%. Of course, in the last month, Bitcoin's up more than 20%, and we're up almost 120% on the year. And again, as I say, buckle up, Buttercup. You ain't seen nothing yet, because this halving bull run should just now be starting to kick off, and nobody has a crystal ball. I don't know where we're going to go, but I'm one of those people that feel that the last cycle might have been cut short a little bit with some shenanigans like the China miner ban, and just we had the scams like we had the big scam, the FTX debacle, but before that, we had the all the yield farming scams that collapsed, and I think that took a lot of the wind out of the sails of Bitcoin as well. So maybe the similar sort of things will happen this time around, but I'm optimistic. I think that we're going to have the exact opposite thing happen, that we're going to have our normal halving cycle bull run, and then things like RFK Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy advising the next president of the United States on what Bitcoin policy should be. They're going to be pouring gasoline on the fire. And again, nobody has a crystal ball, but that is my humble opinion. So speaking of the price, why did this happen? what does the Donald Trump victory mean for Bitcoiners, at least in the United States? But really, what happens in the United States so often has repercussions that are felt around the entire world. So regardless of where you're sitting listening to this podcast, well, the things that are going to happen in the United States in the next 4 years, whether it has to do with Bitcoin or anything in general, like wars that we may or may not get into now, they tend to affect everybody. Of course, everybody knows Donald Trump's infamous campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." But one of the slogans that he started repeating more and more often towards the end of the campaign was his alternate campaign slogan, which was "Promises made, promises kept." Well, with any politician, it's really important to hold them to their campaign promises because so often politicians don't come through for whatever reason, whether they just flat out don't try, whether they want to hold it in reserve so they can maybe run on them again in 4 years, which won't be the case with Trump because he can't run again after this. He'll be one and done now. But promises, particularly political promises, are just that, promises. And until they're fulfilled, it's really important to hold their feet to the fire. So what are those promises? Or at least what are the ones that Bitcoiners care about? I think regardless of what pro-Bitcoin policies Donald Trump may or may not implement, I think the most important promise to most Bitcoiners is a pretty unselfish one. And that was when Trump promised to free Ross Ulbricht on day one. That's pretty straightforward. He can do that with the stroke of a pen, and it's pretty low risk. I mean, it was a campaign promise, so it's expected that he does it. And going into the beginning of his presidency, that's the honeymoon period where you have a little bit of extra political capital. It's a little bit easier to get what you want done, as opposed to, all those midnight pardons that the controversial pardons that we're so accustomed to, where, the outgoing president, the morning before they leave office or late at night before the inauguration of the next president, they start pardoning campaign donors or politically unsavory individuals, etc. So I guess we're 74 days away from inauguration day, less than 74 days, because inauguration happens in the morning. So I guess we'll find out. I think a lot of people are going to hold him to it. I think it's an easy campaign promise to keep. Quite frankly, I am surprised that Biden did not pardon Ross Ulbricht 2 weeks ago, because I know there are people that voted for Donald Trump specifically because they wanted to free Ross Ulbricht. I saw plenty of people on X, for example, say this is the first election they've ever voted in, that they don't think voting matters, that, it's two wings of the same beast. Regardless of who you vote for, nothing ever changes. They're all going to spend the US dollar into oblivion, blah, blah, blah. But because Donald Trump promised to free Ross Ulbricht, people voted for him. And what a stupid maneuver not pardoning Ross Ulbricht weeks ago, because had Biden done that, even if he did it for the wrong reasons, for petty reasons, I mean, that would have knocked a little bit of wind out of the sails of Donald Trump. And who knows, maybe Kamala Harris would be the next president of the United States at this point in time, had he done so. But either way, I'm looking forward to, on January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump keeping that promise and Ross Ulbricht walking out of the Supermax, where he's spent the last more than a decade in solitary confinement. Also, what wasn't originally a day one promise, but has kind of morphed into that, it's another Bitcoin adjacent promise, and that's Donald Trump's promise to fire SEC Chairman Gary Gensler. And this is about more than just S-coins, altcoins. I mean, if you're an ETH head, or if you're a DeFi shitcoiner, you want to see Gary Gensler go because, he's been waging war against the altcoins. He hasn't had the huevos to wage war against Bitcoin directly or against even Ethereum, but he would certainly make altcoiners happy to see Gary Gensler go. But this is also about ending Operation Choke Point 2.0. Because remember, he isn't just making it difficult for you to be a Bitcoiner or you to be an S-coiner. He's also targeting Bitcoin businesses and punishing Bitcoin-friendly banks. Remember the requirement that if a bank custodies Bitcoin, they have to basically hold it as they have to hold one-to-one cash. So if you deposit $1,000 of the Bitcoin into the bank, they have to take $1,000 worth of US dollars and hold them in reserve, which is not a requirement that, is applied to pretty much anything else that banks do. And it's specifically made to scare banks away, to make it too difficult for them to cooperate with Bitcoin-friendly banks. There's other aspects of Operation 2.0 where they've harassed and shut down banks or did or not approve banks, like Caitlin Long's Avante Bank, her first fully reserved bank can't get a charter because with the Federal Reserve, can't get an account, a master account with the Federal Reserve because they're a threat to the system, because they're fully reserved and because they're Bitcoin friendly. Donald Trump also promised to include Elon Musk, RFK Jr., and Vivek Ramaswamy in this administration. So this is also semi-Bitcoin adjacent because, a lot of that has to do with the focus on accountability, not specifically Bitcoin, like, Elon Musk heading up the Department of Government Accountability, but particularly RFK and Vivek are pro-Bitcoin. Remember, RFK Jr.'s list of pro-Bitcoin promises at the Nashville Bitcoin Conference was significantly longer and arguably better, more important than Donald Trump's. And of course, it was Vivek that is credited with changing Trump's mind about Bitcoin in the first place. Remember, in the previous administration, he didn't really know much about Bitcoin and he thought you were a patriot if you used the US dollar. And then it was Vivek Ramaswamy that sat him down and educated him about Bitcoin and why Bitcoin is so great. And I would assume that RFK Jr. has had that chat with him as well. He certainly has to have heard what RFK Jr. said at the Bitcoin conference right before his speech. I maybe absorbed some of that as well. Of course, there's the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. Senator Cynthia Lummis already unveiled the draft legislation that was also at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. So the legislation is already drafted. All it has to do is be passed. Of course, there's other ways that Donald Trump can maybe issue some executive orders that would get the ball moving on that as well. But Senator Cynthia Lummis took a victory lap on Twitter this morning, on X this morning, tweeting, "We are," in all caps nonetheless, "we are going to build a strategic Bitcoin reserve," and then 3 American flags. Of course, even if Trump doesn't accomplish anything during the next 4 years, even if it's just gridlock, even if the other side finds a way to roadblock him at every turn, one thing is crystal clear. All of the proposed tax increases. Remember, Biden had a slew of tax increases proposed, and Kamala basically adopted Biden's his roadmap, his budget blueprint for what would be her administration, raising the corporate capital gains rate. Those things won't be happening now, especially Kamala's insane 30% unrealized capital gains tax, which would have just been, most people said that they had like a snowball's chance in hell of ever happening, but the fact that it was even going to be discussed was just, could you imagine being a Bitcoin OG? What if you were Satoshi Nakamoto and they said you owe 30% of the value of all that Bitcoin that's sitting in Satoshi's wallets? Or, what would that do to MicroStrategy? They've made a tremendous, in theory, paper profit on their Bitcoin, and to have to pay a 30% tax on that Bitcoin, obviously that means you have to dump Bitcoin to pay for it. And of course that would affect more than just your Bitcoin holdings. It was going to be unfathomably horrible for the United States financially, whether it had anything to do with Bitcoin or not. And now that's not going to happen. Hallelujah. Dennis Porter summed it up pretty concisely on X when he posted earlier today. Let's be absolutely clear. The anti-Bitcoin movement died last night. The USA will be the most pro-Bitcoin nation in the world. We will have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. We will enshrine a national law to defend Bitcoin's rights. So again, even if Donald Trump doesn't accomplish any of his pro-Bitcoin goals, at least the war on Bitcoin is coming to an end. Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren absolutely hate each other. He mockingly calls her Pocahontas. They are mortal enemies. So right now, she has basically full reign with banking and financial regulation input in the current administration. And that ends January 20th. Obviously, she was reelected. She's a senator in the old Kennedy seat that's been a Democrat. It's been basically a Kennedy almost all along, except for briefly when Scott Brown won, I think it was a special election to fill Ted Kennedy's seat when he passed away. And then Elizabeth Warren won. So it's been a Democrat stronghold seat. It's in Massachusetts, where you would expect it, a solid blue state. So she's going to continue to be a senator, but she will be neutered January 20th because there is no chance Donald Trump's going to allow her to have any input. They're going to cut her off at the knees. She's going to go back to being irrelevant. And that is a glorious thing for Bitcoiners and for Americans in general. As odd as it may seem, not everybody is happy with the election results. And if you're one of those people, you do have my condolences. I don't hate people that disagree with me politically. I know there's a lot of that going on, but half of the country is literally having a meltdown right now. And this is the result of the same constant propaganda bombardment that literally still has people wearing masks while they ride their freaking mountain bikes outdoors in the wilderness. And I'm not kidding. I freaking saw this in the mountains of New Mexico last week. People, you see one person every hour as you're hiking in the mountains and they go riding by on their mountain bike and they're wearing a freaking face diaper. It's nuts. But my point being, the media scared the living daylights out of half the country about COVID, and they did the same thing with Donald Trump. They literally have half the country believing that Donald Trump is worse than that notorious villain from World War II. Remember, it was a former KGB propagandist, Yuri Bezmenov. He defected to the West in the 1970s, or actually it was like 1970, but in the 1960s, he had allegedly been involved with the KGB and propaganda through the media. And he warned that people are basically, when they're bombarded with fear porn often enough, even for a relatively short period of time, but consistently enough and scary enough, consistently enough, that eventually they become so brainwashed by this propaganda that even if you're the person that's telling them that the world's going to end because of X, and then you say, just kidding, all this time I've been lying to you, this is all propaganda, those people become rendered unable to accept the truth. They're just going to remain scared of that for the rest of their life. And that's the same thing with the virus, with people riding in the middle of the Rocky Mountains with nobody else around, still wearing a face diaper. And the same thing happened with what we refer to as Trump derangement syndrome. Speaking of denial, Senator Cynthia Lummis summed up my thoughts on what happened this weekend, and that is when most of the world went off of daylight saving time. She tweeted out, "It's that time of year again. Until we lock the clock and pass the Sunshine Protection Act, remember to set your clocks back 1 hour." This is a pet peeve of mine. I've spoken about this on previous episodes of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. I know it's a pet peeve for a lot of you too. Remember, Ben Franklin first proposed daylight saving time as a freaking joke. He was trying to illustrate absurdity, and apparently people didn't get it. There are numerous scientifically documented harms of messing with a person's circadian rhythm, and by doing it twice a year, there are illnesses this causes. There's increased car accidents when people go to work tired. People call in sick to work more often the day after daylight savings time, as well as there's long-term health damage from the stresses, the stress response that you impose on someone's body when you mess with their biological clock. We're essentially giving most of the world jet lag twice a year, and we're doing it for absolutely no good reason. Here in Florida, we passed the Sunshine Protection Act years ago, but it requires an act of Congress for us to go off of daylight saving time, just the way that works out. Hopefully, that's something we can get done as well, with people like Cynthia Lummis spearheading that movement, and hopefully enough votes in the Senate to maybe move that along this time. How is this related to Bitcoin? Well, daylight savings time is a fiat construct. It is not a function of time or even of reality. It is an illusion by decree. Fiat. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is truth. It is incorruptible. The government can't control it. Nobody can set the blockchain back or forward by 60 blocks twice a year, even by governmental decree. Daylight savings time is literally the perfect example of a fiat mindset. It is the antithesis of the Bitcoin time chain, and it'd be nice if maybe we see that go away as well. Alrighty then, on to what makes today so special, today and every Wednesday, and that is because it is DCA Wednesday. If you are just joining us, if you are listening for the first time because you saw the price of Bitcoin pump, welcome aboard. You might be asking about DCA and what it means. Well, DCA is short for dollar cost averaging, and dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals, regardless of price. For example, this is going to be our 172nd stack. We started stacking every Wednesday back on July 28th, 2021. So that is our regular interval, weekly on Wednesdays. And so far, we've stacked 171 times. We chose our equal portion to be just $20. I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to keep it affordable. These are all you things. And this is one of those things where if $20 a month means nothing to you, then maybe you pick an amount to DCA that's substantially more than that. Others might be listening thinking the only way I could come up with $20 is if I cut something out of my budget. For some of us, maybe that means we don't go out to dinner one night a week, or you don't go out for drinks after work one night a week. Maybe quit smoking cigarettes. I know people who have done that. They took what they were spending on cigarettes and started dollar cost averaging it into Bitcoin. The point being, these are personal decisions for you to make, kind of a do your own research thing. But the idea is you set it and forget it. Basically, you pick a specific amount and you invest it at a specific interval, regardless of what's happening with Bitcoin's price. So far, by doing that, we've converted a total of 3,420 US dollars into a stack of more than 10 million Satoshis, 10,085,516 sats to be exact. And we did so at an average cost basis of just $33,910.02, significantly now less than half of what Bitcoin's current US dollar value is. To grow that stack today, as usual, I'm going to use the handy dandy Cash App. Cash App is not a sponsor of this show. I just think it's the easiest way here in the United States to stack smaller amounts of Bitcoin. They're not the cheapest method for stacking Bitcoin. So if I were going to purchase more than just $20, maybe I would use somebody else like Gemini or Kraken or even the Evil Empire to do so. Again, these are you do you things. But of note, Cash App does let me transfer my Bitcoin out of Cash App and to my hardware wallet the same day I purchase it, and for free, as long as you are willing to meet a couple of criteria, which I always do because I don't want to transfer just dust amounts. So I wait till I have a couple $100s of the Bitcoin, and then I get to transfer it to my hardware wallet for free, and that makes up for the fact I pay a little bit more in fees for using Cash App. So I already have my Cash App open. I already have money on there because somebody reimbursed me for a purchase I made the other day. So it's just a matter of tapping Bitcoin, tapping buy, entering $20, tapping confirm, and boom, just like that, we've purchased another 25,815 sats. That is actually the least amount of Satoshis we have ever received for our 20 US dollars in the history of this podcast. And that is because we have made an all-time purchase high. We just purchased at $75,731. Previously, our highest purchase price was right after the ETFs were approved, and we purchased at $72,899. Certainly a lot more expensive than our cheapest purchase, which was in November 2022 when we purchased for just $16,469. But either way, that's how it works. When the price goes up, you get fewer Satoshis, and that's the beauty of dollar cost averaging. Our average purchase price is still going to be a lot better off than had we YOLO'd in. So those 25,815 sats raised our total stack now to 10,111,331 Satoshis. And it did raise our average purchase price by about $111. But still, our average cost basis is now $34,021.24. Not too shabby considering Bitcoin is worth about 75,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. Obviously, as the price of Bitcoin goes up, that average cost basis is going to go up as well. But remember, when we did our very first episode, Bitcoin had a US dollar value of about $39,000. So we're doing better than had we YOLO'd in 3 years ago. And of course, we're doing way better than had we YOLO'd in at the top after the all-time high after the spot Bitcoin ETFs were approved, and certainly better than those who are YOLOing in right now. Before I go, I really quick want to ask you to help support this podcast by feeding that algorithm monster. Make sure you are following us on X. On X, we are at BTC Bulletin Pod. If you don't want to or cannot support the podcast through the value for value method, please reach out to me anyway. You don't have to send a boost. I simply like to hear from you. So my DMs are open. Again, you can DM me at BTC Bulletin Pod. If you're not a Twitter user, we're also on Nostr. The Nostr NPub is in the show notes. If you just scroll down through the notes on whatever podcast app you're listening on. Speaking of the podcast app, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and rating and reviewing the podcast does an awful lot to boost us in the rankings to where people will be more likely to find this podcast when they're searching for content to listen to. And if all else fails and you're an old-fashioned guy like me and you just want to send a simple email, my email is open right now, and my email is bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. I do read and reply to all the emails we get. Either way, do not forget to join us next Wednesday and every Wednesday while we grow that stack of Satoshis, as long as people are willing to trade their soon-to-be worthless paper fiat for Satoshis. Either way, though, keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.